there we are. Oh, that beard is growing.
You guys have a beard thing, that competition going. I mean, you both have such impressive beards, and you're both such impressive philosophers at the same time. And I feel like a midget compared to you in terms of beards and also
well,
philosophy.
there are two genders. They're called beards and women.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Cadell, how are you doing?
Doing very well.
Yeah?
Doing very well. Excited for this talk. Ready to duel. Get your sword out.
Yeah. What have you been up to? What have you been up to recently?
I've been doing actually some work as a psychedelic psychotherapist.
Oh, dear. There we go.
Yeah, it's been very interesting.
Yeah, and we just launched a major product in Sweden publicly today called the Osmond Foundation, where we're gonna create medication out of psilocybin, with the Karolinska Institute backing it up and some major philanthropists. It's a major break in Sweden, actually. It was launched today.
Fantastic. Great to hear it.
Yeah.
Good to hear it.
It's all happening.
Great medicine.
Yes, exactly. That's what we think too.
So Alexander, do you remember like your original, inspiration for you woke up in the middle of the night in Prague and said, oh, we should all have a talk about the archetype replacing the theory of the subject in Western existential philosophy? I'm quoting your email here.
Okay. Well, it's more like in my current work, I'm working with Jan Söderqvist, and actually we're going to write together in Tuscany from tomorrow on with face masks as soon as we leave the house. But what I'm interested in is the fact that the sort of the Platonist forms, I think, disappeared with Kant. And this is the difference between Kant and Hegel. They're not necessarily with Hegel any longer. And that's why, ironically, Hegel opens up for Jung. Because what actually comes along after Freud with Jung is the understanding that the archetypes that are shaped in a more Darwinian evolutionary way over long periods of time. So they're not perfect forms or anything that we should aspire to. Rather, the archetypes are survival mechanisms for the tribe as a whole, or the sociant, as we call it these days. And within the sociant, over 60 or 70,000 or even 100,000 years, these archetypes were developed. And with the archetypes, we get these different models, including our personality types within the tribe, that are optimal for the survival of the sociant. And I would say that what Jung discovers is that these archetypes deep inside of ourselves are the things that we inherit, that come with the genetic makeup of what it means to be human, the social biologically developed. And they are actually the forms rather than the Platonist forms. So when we talk about today, we do archetypology, and we try to, for example, in men's work, we try to map what kind of men are there, starting with the priest and the king being totally different and all that. What kind of men are there? What kind of archetypes can we live up to and aspire to be? Then this is what we're talking about. We're talking about personality types actually that serve the community as a whole.
Okay, can I frame this a little before we hear from Cadell a bit?
Yeah.
So in some of our discussions, we're talking about the difference between Freud and Jung a little bit. So I think that's relevant in our discussions. And you guys are both sort of major Freudians. You've both read Freud in a lot of depth, and I'm perhaps have more experience with Jung and reading Jung and his followers. So I'd like to be educated on Freud a little bit here in this conversation, and I'd like a comparison between Freud and Jung, and I'd also like to know the difference between archetypes and Platonic forms, right? What is the difference, and also how does this square with this Jung's idea of individuation and all that?
Okay,
is that a good way?
A lot of issues,
the conversation here.
Cadell, do you want to get in first, and then I can pass, and then I can answer to Andrew's questions.
Sure. I think.
Both you, just to bring it, both you and I are socioanalysts. That's what I describe it. We're doing psychoanalysis, but we imply it on society as a whole. Would you agree on that?
Well, I feel like the method for socioanalysis, however we call it or however it emerges, is emerging. I don't think we have the Freud of socioanalysis. I think it's precisely on the level of method where that will occur. Like I always say, when it comes to people like Hegel and Freud, for myself, the reason why I rely on these figures is not necessarily because of what they say, but more so because of the method they develop. Hegel develops dialectical method, and Freud develops free association as method. Now, because of that, that is a useful analytic tool. These are useful tools. Once you understand the tool of dialectic, once you understand the tool of free association, you are then free to basically, you could in principle forget about Hegel and Freud and just use the method. It's very useful. And in that sense, I think that the method of socioanalysis is yet to be discovered, but it's an extremely exciting possibility and something that I think a lot about.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think this opens the key to anthropology and why anthropology is so big these days. Because anthropology had a golden age, secretly so, in the 20th century, was developed in parallel with the world of philosophy. And anthropology came out of the Jungian revolution. So out of the Jungian revolution, we get the archetypes, we get anthropology, and we get to understand the major narratives of humanity. Of course, I work with these narratives all the time. I try to find the narratives. There's nothing timeless to anything I do, but the sort of long-lasting narratives that constantly return are the ones that we got used to when we were nomadological and we lived in the socion for 60 or 70,000 years. Our genes were shaped. And then we have some other narratives that actually are very short-lived. You only had very recently, and they're probably basically paradigmatic. They're not here to stay for very long. And that's exactly why the anthropological revolution also, we should emphasize that it's not just about Hegel and Freud, but actually the anthropological revolution to me also points toward a golden age. And this golden age, we could call that socioanalysis. I would agree with that completely. It isn't done yet. I think Zizek, for example, has started that process. And I think we're sons of Zizek in that sense.
What's the difference between socioanalysis and what you call tribal mapping? Because, I've talked with Alexander we have about 60 hours of podcasts, and I'm familiar with that your vocabulary, Alexander. And
Okay. The difference between psychology and sociology is the same here. So psychology attempts to be a science, if you could ever do human sciences at all. I'm skeptical, but it's psychology. Greg Henrique is not the guys trying to do that. You get social psychology in between, then you get sociology. They attempt to be human sciences. The great thing with psychoanalysis is that it honestly never tries to become a science, even if Freud says that, but that's actually where Freud fails in that department, or it wasn't what he intended. I would say today that after Lacan, we all know that psychoanalysis is an art form. It's an art form of the human condition. And that's exactly why the attempt to not become a sociologist, but rather to look at yourself as a socioanalyst, is that you take the art form, which is philosophical, and as soon as you move from psychoanalysis to philosophy, like Zizek does, for example, then you actually turn psychoanalysis into an art form. Socioanalysis is just a needed name for something that doesn't try to be human science like sociology. You can do sociological arguments to strengthen the argument, but at the end of the day, socioanalysis is an art form to try to understand society as a whole.
Okay, Cadell, can you give a bit your socioanalysis? How you view socioanalysis, and is that in resonance with what Alexander is saying in terms of it being an art form and not a science?
Well, I actually wanted to precisely affirm what Alexander says about this attempt of psychological and sociological sciences attempting to reduce the subject to a science. I think that this is a absolute humiliation, and it's very infuriating. The reason why it's so infuriating is basically because of the subjective disposition and style of scientists. It's the level of arrogance. It's the level of not being able to basically know their place and know their limits precisely.
Is that where Freud went wrong? I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that Alexander kind of mentioned it, and that's what I always kind of thought. I always thought that's where Jung picked up from Freud in a sense, because Jung was not so insistent on the rational and the scientific. Or is that too simplistic a notion or something?
Look, there are a lot. Here's the thing. Freud was an absolute genius, and there are many places where Freud is wrong, but, and this is so crucial, and this is what all of the straw men of Freud don't understand, is that where Freud was wrong, he was always wrong in an extremely helpful and an extremely productive way.
Gotcha.
He was never wrong in a way that misled. And this is why Lacan put so much emphasis on a return to Freud and a faithfulness to the concepts and the method of Freud. Because Freud is not a place where we go and strictly identify. Like I said, we can forget about Freud once we understand the method in that ideological sense. But when it comes to making productive theoretical interventions, there are many places where Freud was just a little bit off, where we can make huge breakthroughs.
Yeah.
And I can go into great detail with that.
Well, I know Girard also said the same thing about Freud. He really appreciated Freud and appreciated his mistakes as well, because I guess Freud is a speculative, essayist rather than a pure scientist in that sense.
The great thing about Freud is that he's an explorer, and he's an explorer that never leaves libidinal territory until he reaches the death drive. And then there's another bifurcation within psychoanalysis, which is very important to understand. And in the affirmation of the death drive, he makes a little mistake, but again, a mistake in a very helpful way, in a very productive way. Again, we can go into all of these distinctions, but I want to revisit your original question, which was about this position on socioanalysis. For me, I'm in a place where I'm very open to the concepts we develop, and I'm very open to the theory we develop, because I think it's so deeply in its infancy that I don't want to be premature with anything. So I don't strictly identify with any of these concepts like socioanalysis necessarily. I think they're very interesting, and I want to explore them.
So it's a playful territory.
Yeah, I should add that Freud actually gave up on the whole scientific thing because it eventually became psychiatry. And if you're going to talk about a science of the psyche, it must be psychiatry. So because it tries to deal with the hormones and the chemicals you got in your brain, and he hardly tries to do anything else. But that's why psychoanalysis, I think, jumping up from that point, I think psychoanalysis was also, as Freud understood, as an art form more and more the older he got. When he came to America in the 1930s, he got sick of all the ego psychology the Americans were doing. He felt completely misunderstood. And he basically wrote books like Moses and Monotheism in the 1930s instead. Yeah. He went into deep history, which, again, he's an explorer. And he's an explorer of the mind. He's an explorer of history. And that's why we love Freud.
There's one thing, can I just, one interjection? I remember when Freud and Jung were coming over in their boat, and they both said this amazing thing, or Freud said this amazing thing. He said, "We're here to bring the plague." I love that phrase, because it's like the Freudian Jungian revolution is so dramatic.
Yeah, but they were also frustrated, like philosophers are. They frustrated because they knew they would be misunderstood massively. Yeah. That's the problem when you go from sort of an elite expertise, which you work very hard, like I do, explore these ideas, and then just the genius of these guys. Hegel, massively misunderstood. Nietzsche, massively misunderstood. Even Marx. I mean, these guys are massively misunderstood again and again and again. And probably they knew that as they got older, and that's what he meant when he said the plague. But we can leave Freud at that. I agree with Cadell that the interesting thing is the method rather than the character. We're not gonna lick Freud's ass or suck his dick or anything. That's just boring. I mean, we're not idolizing the guy. We just know that there are great methods coming out of these guys. And if anthropology was the 20th century, I coined the term socioanalysis to say that could possibly be the big thing in the 21st century, because we're now entering an era where man versus technology is the most interesting topic of all. And we cannot even imagine human versus human any longer without involving technology into that relationship. That's key, I think. I mean, I'm preparing the question being asked by the machine to us in 20 or 30 years' time. Like, who are you? From a machinic point of view, what would that be? In what way are we different? And the answer to that, short, is pathos, which machines do not have. They cannot crack jokes, and they don't jerk off. So they're obviously not human. I think that's a good starting point. But currently, I'm working with Russo. I'm working with killing the guy once and for all, and I've discovered that it's actually who we
come
get.
on, Russo's already dead.
I know, but it's useful because I'm going to kill the pillar saints and the boy pharaohs of history in the new book. I'm going to kill the celebration of the axial H, and to do that, Rousseau is the best personification of that in the Enlightenment because of the amour propre and amour de soi. He cannot even understand gender. He cannot even understand sex. He doesn't understand that the phallic gaze and the metrical gaze are the two things that are important. So he ends up being this sort of solipsistic narcissist. Now, we've written a lot about that Söderqvist in the past. Obviously, the Libido is full of this because the problem with contemporary society is that it's basically ruled by Rousseau and lynch mobs, and the phallus is lacking. Mm-hmm. And we want to go deeper into that in the new book and look at all of narrative history from that perspective.
Well, if you want
okay, hold on. Cadell, you wrote a book called Sex, Masculinity, and God, right? And Alexander is he's always talking about the phallus and pathos and this kind of thing. And this is probably why, you guys are interested in Freud and there's this taboo around, extreme taboo around all of these subjects in the contemporary society, which Alexander relates to Rousseau. So I want to hear about that from you a little bit, if my question's clear. I have some things that I wanted to say about what Bard was talking about human to human interaction and the machines and who are you. Okay, go for it. We'll come back to this later, your book and stuff later.
Okay,
yeah, we can go deep into that. I just wanted to say that this here's the thing is that in science they call it the mind-body problem since the origin of science, but what it forgets is that it's mind-body-other, and other is always our knowledge is intersubjective. And science has a huge trouble with knowledge which is intersubjective. Science has a huge problem with the fact that our knowledge is constitutively grounded in intersubjective relations, and we're trying to figure out what we are, and we're trying to figure out our desire through the other. In that sense, to me, when Bard says, the machine isn't human because they don't jerk off and they don't have pathos, what I would say is that the location of pathos and the location of our most intimate fantasies is actually where we connect to something alien, something that is transforming us into something totally other. And I think the deeper you go into your pathos, the deeper you go into a dimension of yourself which is so horrific to normative morality and which is so horrific to the normal things that people accept among others, that you transform the very nature of your style and your persona. And the reason why science has such a huge trouble understanding this dimension is because science is, because it doesn't understand the dimension of others, is extremely biased towards what I would call autistic subjects. And autistic subjects are much different than the type of subjects which psychoanalysis is concerned with, which is neurotic subjects, hysterical subjects, perverted subjects, psychotic subjects. Now, psychoanalysis, I think, and a new book just came out talking about it, should start to approach the reality of autistic subjects. Psychoanalysis should have a theory of autistic subjects, if only so that we can deal with the problem of scientific knowledge being fundamentally autistic.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. And I think autism is really related to neurosis more than hysteria, because hysteria is more to do with emotions, right? And autism is a sort of
well, we can also
sort of a hyper mental state where you're just disconnected from all these things that you're talking about.
Yep. I mean, I think there is a meaningful distinction to be made between autism and neurosis. I don't necessarily think they're the same thing, but I think that they can definitely overlap. But the important thing I want to say is that when it comes to the deep concern of neurotics and hysterics, it has to do with the domain of others. And this is why there's a type of this is why psychoanalysis disrupts and upsets the scientific universe, and why science has trouble sublating psychoanalysis. It basically cannot sublate psychoanalysis. So it says that it's irrelevant, pseudoscience. Lacan actually has a good formula for what psychoanalysis is, which is that psychoanalysis is a form of knowledge which is still emergent and which is concerned with the status of the subject in itself, and which required a scientific universe to emerge. So in other words, science is a precondition for psychoanalysis, but is not reducing psychoanalysis.
Oh, that's good.
I agree here. And this is why we do the studies on Russo here, because starting with Russo, if you're looking at sort of mass culture, early 21st century, and the rampant hyper-narcissism we have today because of the internet. This goes back to the Russoian idea that you cannot trust a stranger at all, although you desire him all the time. So you want the gaze of the other. This is amour propre in Rousseau, and the opposite is amour de soi, which is supposed to be your self-love. I would say that you can't even speak about self-love unless you have loving relationships with other people, because you're a tribal creature, right? This is Rousseau's weird fantasy. And I think the key here is that he doesn't make a difference between the nomadology and the eventology involved. We've been talking a lot about this before in previous podcasts. So nomadology is basically the eternal return of the same, but it's also the unconditional love that we associate with the female body and with the matriarchal love, the matriarchal gaze that meets us when we're born. The other one is the phallic gaze. This is supposed to be the gaze of the fatherly figure, or the priest, or the chieftain or king, if you like, who would see you one day and then discover you and help you on your way towards your archetype. Now, what's so misunderstood is that the phallic gaze, it's what's so, I go deeper and deeper into it, but the phallic gaze is both nomadological, it's both unconditional, but it's also conditional in the sense that it looks at reality first before it looks at you. And this is key to psychoanalysis. This is the really great psychoanalyst. He has the phallic gaze in the sense that he can look at you, but he doesn't actually have any feelings towards you. He forces you to look at yourself. But he will give you your proper reality check on every level you go through during psychoanalysis. And to do socioanalysis, to do the same thing with society as a whole. So the phallic gaze, if you get access to it, has an unconditional loving quality to it, if it's fatherly, a mentor or a father who wants to guide you through life, yes. But it first looks at reality before it gives you the tough news on where you need to go to succeed. So it's grown up and it's adult. And this is what is so desperately lacking in our society. It's not only phallus, it's the phallic gaze itself. And that starts with Rousseau because his amour propre is just trying to get recognition from others. And I think this trying to recognition from others is a mistake, because it really should be the try to get the recognition of the elders or of the fatherly figures or the people who will guide you through your life, so that you can then go back and explore self-love. This is completely lacking in Rousseau. That's why Rousseau is the starting point of the contemporary mass problem with hyper-narcissism. So you go online today and everybody has been promised they're going to be discovered, they're going to be seen by the phallic gaze, there are satellites in the sky that are looking down on the planet, and you're going to get thousands of likes for anything you do. And now you discovered 20 years into the internet revolution that nobody likes anything you do because you're just a mediocre, regular human being. And people are devastated by it. This is why Byung-Chul Han speaks about depression as the response to the previous deformation. And before that, that was the discipline, that was the decapitation. The decapitation during feudalism was replaced by the deformation during industrialism. And now in the network society, we're moving towards depression itself. And I think all these things together, when you mix them together, you can do proper socioanalysis with it.
Can you make a link to, we had this discussion about the cold gaze and like say the warm, cold and hot, right? Because the phallic gaze, I guess, is cold, is a cold.
It's both. No.
But it does have this warmth and unconditional love.
No. This is why it's so important to be Hegelian, because people constantly put these things as opposites against one another. They say the mother should represent certain things, and then the father should represent the opposite. This is just sloppy. No, what Hegel teaches us is that very often one thing is one thing. So say we associate the female body with the nomadology. And nomadology dominated our worldview for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. The eternal return of the same. The possibility that an event can happen is only a 4,000-year-old idea. And if the event happens, things can be changed forever. So a new technology can come along, or a savior can enter the scene, and suddenly everything changes. And then history is changed forever after that point in time. Now, if the eventology comes with us only 4,000 years old, it's not the opposite of nomadology. Nomadology is still there. The world undeniably circulates. It adds to it. So the phallic gaze must be understood as a gaze that is both nomadological, which is warm, and eventological, which is cold.
Yeah. Well,
that's the hard trick. That's why Hegel is so important.
I was thinking in alchemical terms, because the sulfur is the heat that rises, and mercury is the coolness that comes down. But actually, they're one thing. They're not separate. So
yeah,
but there's a dynamic relationship between them, and
well, the Hegelian, I would say, very often says that one thing is one thing only, and the other thing you start talking about eventually is that thing plus something else. And it's the plus you add to it that's interesting. What I love with Cadells' work, and would love to get into tonight, though, is the fact that Cadell is pretty much obsessed with negative dialectics and negations. And they also play into this. So it's... hey, it's wonderful to do dialectics.
Go for it.
To say what you're saying here, Hegel often says one thing is one thing. It's crucial that it's one thing plus lack. So usually what the opposing pole is, the so-called opposing pole, is usually empty and lacking. And there's a lot of responsibility actually on the higher pole, or the one thing that's actually one thing, to go into what its own lack is. Because when it goes into what its own lack is, it actually gains that third weird power of transforming itself into something really different. So in that sense, I mean, it's a really useful tool to analyze oppositional determination, because usually when you have opposites, usually it's one thing. Like, for example, Marx would say, for example, the two-party state is actually just an effect of capitalist reproduction, and it's just reproducing capital. And then the two-party system is kind of a lack. It's empty, and we all know it's empty, and now we see it's empty because it's just a reality TV show.
Yeah. So you could certainly apply that on eventology, nomadology, and the relationship too. And the great thing with Hegel is you shouldn't think too chronologically about him. The thing is that if you study something, you're free actually to change the order of things when you study it. Because here, for example, if eventology is both eventology and nomadology at the same time, nomadology is the one that has the negation. It lacks eventology. So fair enough.
The thing is, what Bard's saying here is that if you are like a pure, if you're the singularity of the subject, you can actually rewrite history. And I mean, even Bard does that as an active performance. Emphasizing certain chronological dates, which he's organizing that past. That's as something that emerges with Bard as a figure. And that's what a great thinker, in some sense, does, is creates his own history.
Yeah, the future is contingent, but the past is necessary. It's fundamental.
Well, what I also, the thing that got me excited about Hegel a little bit was when I connected it to this idea of Buddhist emptiness, and then Cadell was saying, "Oh, you can't reduce it to Buddhism," but I think there's something radical in Buddhist emptiness that is an actual practice, thing that you embody and stuff. Whereas if I just read Hegel, it would be just propositional to me and interesting to apply in an intellectual way. But how do you apply that, like in terms of a practice that would transform you and change you and
yeah, well, that's what I'm interested in. So let me give the distinction I give, and I'm not saying that I have actually explored Buddhism. I've gone to Buddhist temples and talked to Buddhist monks and so forth. I do not call myself an expert on Buddhism, but when it comes to the difference between what I would call popular Western Buddhism, and I'm not saying this is like, if I talk to the most rigorous, deepest Buddhist monk, I'm going to get this. But when I see the popular Western Buddhist philosophy, it's what I see is basically an ahistorical emptiness. And now the emphasis, here's my distinction I'd want to make, is that Buddhism emphasizes the inner void. Even if you go to the Buddhist sutras, They emphasize the heart, and they emphasize the empty fullness of the heart, and they place that as a sort of an anti-transcendental principle in some sense. And I think
so you get to the Vajrayana, which it changes that. And I think you're talking about Mahayana right now.
Yeah, this is incredible, and this is not nonsense. This is incredibly deep stuff.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say emerges in Hegel, and also I think emerges in figures like Heidegger, is a type of historicity of nothingness. So the focus is not so much on the empty void of the subject, but more so the way in which subjects organize around the void. And I think that so the emphasis would be, for example, on the way Buddhist communities organize their practices, their rituals around the void. And that's so interesting to think, because to me, it gets me into thinking metaphors of black hole. It gets me into thinking metaphors of subjectivity as the sort of or language as the material signifiers which are organizing around a void or organizing around a black hole. And I think we get the potential to develop a deep historical theory of what the becoming of this void entails. And I think that in that sense, what I'm saying is I'm less interested on the absolute ontological validity of what Buddhism identifies, but more so I'm interested in the collective socio-cultural practices which are developed around cultivating knowledge of this void.
I would add that
I think that we get that capacity in Hegel. Let me just say that because for Hegel, the ultimate negativity and the ultimate void is confrontation with death itself, and the ultimate fear in the heart of the subject. That basically Hegel says you are brought to your truth and you discover your truth in the face of death itself.
The night of the world. Subjectivity, yeah, I agree. When it comes to Buddhism, though, there's a difference in Mahayana and Vajrayana, and to me, Mahayana perfects nomadology. It takes nomadology to its logical conclusion, which is that the only way for something that endlessly repeats itself is to try to get out of the loop. Okay, and then of course that's what Mahayana Buddhism tries to do. But the Vajrayana response, since it's mixed with Zoroastrianism, especially, it comes out of Tibet and Central Asia, it adds the eventological element. So it puts Buddhism into a much more social category, and the social category can be other things too. Now, the interesting thing though is that none of these traditions talks about individual subjectivity as anything else but a void to be filled, because it's essentially along the timeline. You're a child. Hey, you're nobody. You haven't lived a life at all. So in Zoroastrianism, for example, the goal in life is to live a full, rich life called Harvatat, but then also to die one day with Harvatat, if you're lucky, to pass on transcendence to the next generation, which is called a Meritat. This is exactly why the Persians never built pyramids, for example. This is exactly why they just threw the corpses out in the desert when people died, because you already had achieved what you set out to do, which was to live a full life, Harvatat, and then pass on the heritage to the next generation. So to be full as a subject is to have lived a full life. That's the idea there. That's not too different from the Hegelian concept, because the subject is constantly trying to fill itself with content. And obviously in Lacan, it goes all the way. And Lacan basically says it's impossible. It will never happen. We desire to fill ourselves with some kind of content, and it's still the gaping hole that it always was. And yeah, because if it wasn't, we'd go and kill ourselves. Zoroastrians would agree. But the Zoroastrians would then put that into the perspective. You're a child here, you can an adolescent here, you're an adult here, you can then become an elder, you can become a forefather, even if you're really successful at things and, be a role model. You can become an icon after you die, even. You can become a smaller god. All of these things are possible within that time span because they look at it tribally and they look at it over the entire lifespan. I think that's what Vajrayana Buddhism catches on. That's what it does.
Well, the thing that I'm sort of obsessed with, and it's very fluid. It's not, so just forgive me here. There's this Bard's Eventology, which I guess begins in Zoroastrian and moves on with Judaism, and so I want to combine Vajrayana with the Hebrew tradition, which has a story to it. It has a kind of it has this narrative structure as well. So I want to combine the narrative with the deep non-dual with the deep non-dual traditions on some level. I don't know if that's possible, but those are my two obsessions. Yeah.
I can speak to that. So there's an important, I would recommend first to read the intro chapter to Less Than Nothing, E per si muove, where I think he gives a clear, precise formula of the Hegelian dialectic as basically the becoming of narrativization itself. So the becoming of narrativization itself is the story self-consciousness or subjectivity is telling itself about being itself, and that is the becoming of the subject. So it basically mobilizes, it's basically the ultimate mobilization of narrative, the ultimate movement of narrative. That's what we're studying. And that is a story which is emerging. Mm-hmm. It's emerging in our collective story. It's what we're doing right now. Like the emergence of all these podcasts, the emergence of all these, talking about deep philosophical concepts. This would be something that Hegel would have anticipated as kind of the emergence of a more distributed philosophy, which is, again, working out the concept itself.
I agree strongly. That's why I'm talking about process and event. So at the end of the day, process was the original philosophy. We mistakenly think that things started with Plato or something in the West, and then people came along and did process later. No, Heraclitus was long before Plato, and before Heraclitus, we have the Zoroastrians. And actually, if you read Byung-Chul Han's rewriting of East Asian history, which is fantastic, you discover that all East Asian cultures have always emphasized the symmetries and constant process and movement. And this idea that there are fixed forms or anything like that, that just comes way, way later with the Greeks, especially with Plato, and it's actually quite isolated to the West. It doesn't make much sense to a nation at all. The Indians never subscribe to the Chinese, the Japanese never do.
Because we started off talking about archetypes.
Oh, the archetypes are universal. You'll find them everywhere. Don't worry about that. Archetypology will be very universal because anything that was developed over hundreds of thousands of years was probably developed both with Inuits in Canada and with people in New Guinea and in Brazil in the jungle. You will find it because people were nomads. And people were nomadic. That's why we call it nomadology. Nomadology is both, it's a Deleuze term. Nomadology is both that we're on the move all the time. So the story is about how we have to be on the move all the time or otherwise we die. But nomadology is also, it's a story of process. So it becomes quite natural. Nomadology becomes the eternal return of the same. Every season, you come back to the same point. Every year is a new year, but it's still the same year as the last year. And with the permanent cell, we discovered that if we store information the way we store grain, then we build huge constructions, we irrigate water. All these things we do create abundance on a level we've never seen before. And that creates the possibility of a different world than the previous one. For better or worse, yeah, but eventology means there's a hope this could be a better world than the previous one. That idea is then brand new. It's not opposed to nomadology. It can be added to nomadology. This is what the Chinese and the Indians try to do as well. Of course, then the problem was with the Abrahamic religions in the West, especially with Islamic Christianity, is that they threw out the nomadology, stayed with eventology and the massive focus on what Muhammad or Christ did in certain dates and what they sacrificed and, the battles they won or whatever. There's this obsession with these guys, which eventually leads to the separation of church and state in the West. It becomes unattainable to keep eventology outside of nomadology. And then nomadology becomes capitalism. It came back to haunt us. It was obvious that capitalism, as the great ghost of our culture, is nomadological. It's just a repetition of the same all the time. That's what capital is. And we're now fighting with that. It's called market forces. And we see the emptiness in an eventological sense in that. We should just accept that it's there. But the eventology has to come back in again. Its name is phallus. We threw it out with the bathwater after 1945, and we're lost because of it. Postmodernism, if we criticize it, is nothing but nomadology again without eventology. That's the problem. So
I want to know what the masculine and the feminine principle have to do with like the phallus and are we is that the same thing or
no
slightly different, okay. Right? Maybe you wanted to clarify that.
Precursors are always important. That's number one thing with Hegel, right? The precursor to the event, before the event is even possible, is the fact that men learn from the context of where they are at. So to go out hunting or to win a war, you learn from the circumstances where you're at. But you also forget that information the next thing you do because you can't keep it. So the next war is going to be like the previous war anyway. There's no technological development or anything like that at all because you don't store information anywhere. When somebody dies, the information dies with them. Everything is memorized beside that. The maximum amount of information is constant for hundreds of thousands of years before written language arrives and changes the rules of the games completely. Now we then add that this is why event becomes a new idea, but it should always be combined with nomadology. We should always have a society that respects and understands that human life is both circular and linear at the same time. That is what I require. That's what's called process event. Then I would add to that, what Cadell's work is so damn important here, is I think Cadell gets Hegel better than any of his contemporaries. And I think negation, the way Hegel presented, is probably the third idea that philosophy ever came up with. I think anything else that philosophy came up with is minor compared to process, event, and negation. That's how important Hegel is.
Can I go into, well, thank you, Bard, for the compliment. Can I go into a little bit of your question there, Andrew, about the masculine and the feminine, the difference between the two?
Yeah, I want to go there for sure.
What the hell we're talking about when we say masculine and feminine? You know, everyone knows, you know, the famous statement by Freud that, you know, the concepts masculine and feminine are the most confused concepts in science. And, you know, the way we use those concepts are extremely confusing. There are some Lacanians who actually prefer to use the concepts left and right, geometrical concepts instead of masculine and feminine. They claim that we move too quickly when we label something masculine and feminine, that we're usually, you know, stumbling around in the dark with these concepts.
Well, Alexander uses phallus and matrix as the two sort of.
Right. So I mean, that's interesting. I mean, we could have a conversation about that. So yeah. The thing is that when Freud was going about defining these things, basically what he means when he says libido is masculine is that what he means is that libido is action and libido is one. So libido is action and libido is one is probably more accurate than saying libido is masculine, to be honest. So saying libido is action is a good starting principle. And then you can say that the opposite of libido is it's again like this Hegelian principle of there's one and a lack. And basically the lack is what we call femininity.
Yeah.
And femininity becomes what we label it as passive. So the classical metaphysical distinctions are active, passive, and maybe that doesn't map precisely, but there is a way in which what we call masculine and feminine is kind of an active pointing, going and wants to go in, and the passive is receiving, being in.
Sure.
So this basic distinction about going in and being in is what we mean when we say masculine and feminine. And so you can even say, for example, science is masculine because it's constantly pointing and trying to understand the outside world, trying to get somewhere where it could finally find its place where it could be in.
Yeah.
And you could say psychoanalysis is somehow feminine because the analyst is a pure receiver of the subject's speech. You can just say anything and the analyst will just be there. And it's just receiving. You can come in.
Sure. Yeah.
I call these things phallic and matrical, and I'm very adamant about it. So libido's on the phallic side. What we mean with that is
Absolutely.
Yeah. What I mean with that is that nomadology is fundamental. Nomadology wins at the end. The universe started with a big bounce anyway. So it's just in and out, in and out. Okay, it pumps, right? Anything that pumps and has a pulse is nomadology. So, of course, men come to women because women represent reproduction. They are the ones who reproduce. They give birth to children. Hey, that's half the job done. That's the nomadological part. Eventology then, when it arrives 4,000 years ago because of information accumulation, is that men can start to make themselves redundant outside of the reproductive process. And that redundancy can be turned into an abundance of resources. And we call that civilization. That's why men are usually the ones, not women, who are on fire about changing the world for the better. And what they mean with that is that we could build things we never built before. We could try to do things we never tried before. We have the resources resources now, and we could do that. And that to give that some kind of direction is the job of religion. So the job of religion is basically, religion is fundamentally a masculine enterprise, not a feminine one. If the guys get the religion right, usually the women benefit from it. It's a very Zoroastrian take on religion, but I actually agree with that. I think religion is not a women and children thing. I think religion should definitely be a men's thing to begin with. It should be the separation of priest and king to begin with, to understand the two different archetypes. And then you can organize the world accordingly. And this is where the engineer or the architect comes into the picture. Why I celebrate these things in my work with Jan Söderqvist is that these ideas of the engineer and the architect is what we need today. We're going to save the planet. We're going to make people get along through crypto so they don't kill each other. And we're going to make strangers love each other through new technologies. All the things that we need to do right now, urgently, the next 50 to 100 years. Point towards a new eventology, a new massive phallic mission. This phallic mission is basically save the planet for humans to begin with, and then prepare humans for meeting the machine eventually along the way. Now, these are huge technological challenges, and technological challenges are perfect for eventology. That's exactly what eventology tried to do when it built civilization over the past 5,000 years. And this is in the masculine in the sense that it's in the phallic mode. Because the matrical mode is the reproduction and keeping everything going so a new generation can be born. Without that, we're done. The phallic can then add value so that the next generation could possibly have a better life than the previous one, or at least dream about it. That's where the phallic dreams come into the picture.
Look, religion is, going on what Bard says, religion is what happens when men of a particular historical time figure out how to do what's best and what's in the best interests of the women and the children in a way in which it creates positive sum synergies among the community. And that's what we call religion. And the reason why religion has declined is because the religions of the modern period and the pre-modern period no longer match the historical reality of the 21st century. And so that requires new phallus. It requires new thinking about masculinity in order, basically, what you end up trying to think is a new religion. And that's why I say religion is not something which is subject. Once we understand that religion evolves, once we understand that not only does religion evolve, but religion leads to a type of bootstrapping process where it causes its own cause, in that sense, when we try to think about what the future religion will be, it'll almost be like the metaphor of Jesus, where you die and you rise from the dead. Religion died, and now it's going to rise from the dead.
I think religion is rising from the dead, and I think all the traditional religions are going to arise as well, but they're going to transform as well.
They'll arise and they'll arrive.
Suit the time.
Yeah, they'll emerge in a totally new form.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and this sort of atomism and individualism that Descartes and Kant and Russo practiced didn't really work that well, did they? So we're throwing some old religions out with the bathwater anyway, that we have developed the last 300 years, didn't really work, didn't have universal appeal for very good reasons. So we can at least admit that those are religions too, the bad religions, dead religions.
Basically, Newton, Descartes, Leibniz, I would say, Spinoza, Hume, Kant, all of these guys are geniuses, but they fall short in such an important way that ultimately changing the axioms of their philosophy leads to their destruction. I agree strongly, yeah. So it's a theological question, to be honest about it. I agree on that completely. So yeah, that's where we're heading. That's where we're heading next. We need to build that. And I would say in my work then, this is why I'm critical of Taoism. Although I love the Taoist tradition, I almost converted to Taoism in the 1980s, but I refused at the end. The problem with Taoism is that it stays within the yin and the yang. So it stays within this idea of masculine and feminine as two major forces of reality. And this is exactly why Chinese culture has to introduce Confucianism as a third force. And that when China tends to go tyrannical. I would say that the first division you need to make is the division between different men within masculinity. This is different between for Zoroastrians, the difference between the king and the priest are fundamental.
That's the first division you make. And after you made that division, which is the division between mind and body, are both separate entities and also collaborative entities. So you understand how you function as a human being. After you've done that, you can start saying, oh, okay, by the way, men and women can also be separated. And by the way, women and men have different stories or different narratives about reality and how things work. Because the female narrative or the magical narrative will always be the story about everything returns to the same. That's any fairy tale you tell children will be exactly that way. It is also about the nomadic tribe getting up in the morning and moving on to the next stop because otherwise they die. These are nomadological stories and they're fantastic. They're the basic of narrative. But on top of that, you can have the mythological narratives that are possible since the last 4,000 years, which are called civilization, and which we need more than ever to top on the nomadological narratives. This is the return of the phallus that we're talking about. Yeah. And the phallus must be split. The problem with Taoism is when I work with this is that, oh yeah, you got the yin, yeah, that's nomadology, and you got the yang, and you think there should be eventology, but the yang is just one thing. What Zoroastrians realized was you had to split that. So Ahura and Masta are two different entities within the masculine. The Ahura, which is ancient Persian for being, and Masta, which is ancient Persian for sense or mind, are two different entities that collaborate. Ahura Masta means it's both being and it's mind at the same time, which is way more Hegelian, as you could just find out.
Being and mind.
Yeah, that means there's always three here. And this is what Judaism inherits, because when Judaism rewrites the Exodus out of Egypt after the encounter with the Zoroastrians in Babylon, and the Hebrews come back as Jews to the Promised Land and build the second temple, sponsored by the Persians, they rewrite the Exodus. It's no longer just Moses leading his people. It's Moses and his two siblings, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And with Moses being the priest and Aaron being the king or the chieftain, and with Miriam being the matriarch, you get the triadic structure. That's the most stable structure over time. And I would say it's the both imperial and the nationalist structure of any system larger than tribe we ever invented has to have this sort of triadic structure to it. The US Constitution is a perfect example of that too.
But it's a dynamic structure, right? The
and
three is always a dynamic structure, whereas the four is a solid structure. Like
exactly. And the Indians have it in religion, at least. They got it with the Shiva and Vishnu and Kali. But the problem with Chinese culture does not have the triad. It has either the yin or yang, or it has the Confucian dictatorship or tyranny, more or less. And that the only reason why Confucianism became such a big idea in China 2,500 years ago was because it left out the three and stayed with the two. So there was no dialectical turn. Yin and yang are not a dialectical relationship. Mm-hmm. It's a try towards a balancing act, a sort of harmony, a harmonious act. Yeah. And that is very similar to the separation of church and state, which is, of course, then the problem with the West. These are the two major problems we deal with now philosophically. It's the separation of church and state, 5th century Rome. Okay, major problem for the West. And we live with the consequences ever since. And China has always had the problem that Taoism in itself was not enough. And that's why Taoism split and eventually turned into Buddhism as mother and child worship in China. And then the other version was Confucianism. And the problem with China still today is that China has such a fiendishly hard problem dealing with plurality. And plurality is the key to freedom and to creativity. That's what the Chinese are dealing with right now. And I think we owe them a response to that. We owe them a philosophy as a response to Xi Jinping's current tyranny dictatorship in China. And that has to be a sensocracy, which they're developing, but a plural system. And this is why these terms, antagony, come back all again. Like you're only becoming intelligent by constantly being challenged by opponents who disagree with you, rather than people who just agree with you all the time. And this is why we criticize the dictators of history in the new book and call them boy pharaohs and pillar saints, because they're too scared of being antagonically challenged in anything they do. Because that requires a system that is plural at its core. And China still hasn't developed that.
Yeah. And I think of the Freudian repression. When you repress that Antigone, then you get all this chaos that we see today. And when regret this dynamic, conversation or process of rubbing up against each other, which the masculine really enjoys, right? But why is there then so much why is there so much loathing of the masculine in the culture at the moment? Like that's it seems very present or.
It starts after 1945. It was Hitler and Stalin and colonialism, and we blew up the bomb in August 1945 and scared the shit out of ourselves. We realized that we can kill ourselves easily. We can press a button and kill ourselves. Now, after 1945, all those things are phallic. I mean, there's nothing more phallic than dropping an atomic bomb or something. So, yeah, we're terrified of phallus because phallus can also kill us. So if phallus is associated with shadow, it will kill us. Gotcha. So we are dealing with phallus, but the way we dealt with phallus in the West was that we try to hide it and push it down and suppress it and take it away. And Jung and Schmidt, all these other guys warned us about doing it, and Strauss warned us about doing it. It's now coming back to haunt us. And I think that's exactly what happened, because once the internet came along and we got into this sort of very effeminate victimhood culture that we're stuck with now, and we're stuck with for the past 30 years, the only way out of that is some genuine phallic projects that actually could move humanity forward. And that's why I'm writing about engineers and architects and why I love them. And I want to work with engineers and architects in everything I do, my philosophy, because I think we need to be whole new technologists that challenge our minds, and we can create a better world because of it. We need cosmopolitanism. We need the love of strangers. That's called crypto. We need to fix the ecology. We call that ecotopianism, because environmentalism is simply not enough. It's just dystopian. And at the end of the day, the ultimate goal of all this is to create a protopianism, not another utopianism, not another dystopianism. We had enough of both. So it's a dialectic relationship where we discover that protopianism is the way forward. And protopianism is the original Zoroastrian ideal, the frasho kereti, an ever-renewed, refreshed world with new challenges that we take on gladly every day. That kind of world is the only world we could consider and think of. And that's why the protopians, to me, is the name of the digital priesthood we're building right now. We are the first protopians right here. And we're going to work with artists and philosophers and architects and engineers and all these people who want to build a new world. And if we need to make an exodus to do it, we'll make the exodus. Otherwise, we'll do it right here and now where we're located. We're doing digitally right now during the Corona months. We've done it immensely already. I think augmented reality is the next big thing over the next 20 years. Then probably we'll meet AI. We can collaborate with AI in a symbiotic, transcendental relationship with it. So I think all these things are possible. It's my fucking job to write about it the way Marx and Nietzsche wrote about promising things like the proletariat or the Übermensch. And today that is writing about protopianism.
I just want to say, maybe going off a little more and developing your question there, Andrew, about why is there so much hatred of the masculine? Freud knew that the hatred of the father was actually what was underlying hatred of the father was the deepest possible love of the father. People hate the father, or people hate the masculine, because it's an unconscious provocation on masculine energy to come up with a better solution to our current problems. It's the way in which, that the girl, or it's a way in which that the girl who has a crush on the guy will provoke and
test him, and
poke at him, test him,
torture him even,
so that he'll become the man she wants. But she can't go about doing it directly. She has to go about doing it with irrational, indirect provocations. And the man has to, raise his consciousness to the level of understanding what's going on. And I think that men, by and large, over the past few years, and I think increasingly in the future, are going to rise to this challenge.
I agree.
Or disconnect from completely and end up sort of, disconnected, right?
The problem, though, with this shit test that's going on, and young guys have found out it's a huge shit test. I say, yes, it is. The problem, though, is that if the young men jump to conclusions too quickly, they will go towards tyranny and they will love the fake phallus. That's exactly what happened in the 1930s with Stalin and Hitler and those guys too. The risk for that is actually immense, especially in the United States. So I think that's what we wrote about the fake phallus and authentic phallus and digital libido. We warned about the fake phallus. Again, there are way more fake phalluses around at times like this than there are authentic phalluses around. So the question is then, who is then the authentic phallus, and could we ever see him? And you and I, Andrew, have explored this together with Thomas Hammerich in our webcast together. I would say that the fake phallus comes out of the lynch mob and senses that there's a shared voice within the lynch mob. There's like a shared agreement within the lynch mob. And to get the tension out of the lynch mob and find an abject and attack the abject, the scapegoat mechanism, somebody personifies the abject all of a sudden, puts on a uniform and becomes Hitler, and then rises to power very, very quickly. I think the risk for that is enormous. It's happened already in China. His name is Xi Jinping, and since 2014, he's now officially the dictator of communist China.
Well, maybe
we don't want that to happen in other places. But the problem is this: you got to wait for the authentic phallus. You got to ask all these phallus, well, who are you? In what way you're authentic? And the only authentic phallus is really the guy who stands up to the lynch mob and say, we can do better than that. We can do better than being dystopians or vulgar utopians. We can do better by being protopians instead. And this is what is required for us to go protopian. So the guy who stands up and says no to the lynch mob, he might be crucified because of it. That's happened before. But he is the hyperject. The precursor is the hyperject to what we call the savior in our culture, that the Jews call the Messiah.
The Messiah,
and of course, and the Persians, the Persians invented the concept, called it the socio. And please note, the socio is a function. It's a function that steps in when the phallus is lacking in society, personifies the phallus, has the phallic energy, and gives you the phallic vision and the phallic strategy and says, we're going to go there. And the name for that is exodology. It's all about the exodus. And I believe strongly that we as philosophers have to formulate that exodology into digital and into the global and into the world we're going into now, the paradigm shift that we're currently going through. And the implicate order of that was capitalism. The explicit order of that is essentialism, and see if we can go towards a communism of some kind. But we need to do precisely that. That's the greatest challenge the next 50 to 100 years in the world of philosophy, according to me. And that is where I tell the guys to watch out and wait for the authentic phallus. Wait. Because if they go for fake phalluses now, they go for all these alt-right guys, and soon they're going to be alt-left guys around. They try to be the cheap, the quick fix, the short route to tyrannical powers. You can finally submit to that fake father figure, so you can finally get all that frustration out of your system.
I want to go back just a little bit, because I think maybe Cadell has some good insight into the psychoanalytical basis of why we have this fake phallus and why we have the what's the authentic and what's the fake phallus. If you follow Bard's analysis here, right, the fake phallus being the sort of pseudo masculine, and I guess the authentic phallus being the really courageous, one who stands up to the lynch mob, etc. How does that happen? What is I'm asking because we had a kind of conversation, and I always have this, kind of Freudian, Jungian idea. There's this devouring mother and the tyrannical father, and that and Bard was kind of coming down on me about that, and so I want to hear, I want to hear if you have insights on what's going on there.
I will answer your question. I was having a session. I won't disclose any information other than an interesting anecdote, where there was basically a guy struggling with orientation and desire. I don't know how to direct myself, and I don't know my desire.
Yeah.
And then I basically said to him, what does it feel like when you have an erection? You've got your orientation, you've got your desire. There's no question about it. You know your orientation, you know your desire. The reason why you don't get your orientation and desire is because you're disconnected from your body. You need to work from the ground up. You need to integrate your dick. You need to integrate your stomach. You need to integrate your heart. You need to integrate your voice. You need to integrate all of that in order to think properly, so that you'll have your orientation and desire. And for me, that would be an authentic phallus. An authentic phallus is a man whose action is aligned with the actual energy of his body. And a pseudo phallus is a man who's basically caught in the clouds. And he's using his direction and his orientation and his desire to mask the actual sexual conflict of his body.
Mm-hmm.
Contradictions of his body. He can speak his desire, and he knows what he wants, and there's no doubt about that. The man who is using his intellectual orientation and his intellectual desire to run away from the problems of the body is, for me, the fake phallus. And those guys don't actually have relations. Those guys are thrown around by their wives. It doesn't matter how intelligent they are.
Yeah.
You could have the most intelligent guy in the world, and just wait till you see the dynamics at home with the wife.
Yeah,
the wife will throw him around like he's nothing.
Yeah. And the wife was always controlling him on some level, because
that's what we talk about.
He thinks he's in control in his mind, but he's not at all in control because he's just connected with you know.
She's probably frustrated because her shit tests are too successful. So there you go. He's shit. That's what we talk about. Boy pharaohs, pillar saints, and we also discuss Peter Pan syndrome.
And the Peter Pan syndrome, yeah.
And Peter Townsend works. And we also developed the idea of the Caligula syndrome. That's fantastic, because with Caligula syndrome, we also have an understanding that you might be perfectly fine. You just haven't gone through a Cadell Last session. You haven't discovered actually how you're going to define your desire. But actually, the world around you is so fucking crazy and full of so much penis hatred or whatever, that you cannot be a man in that environment. You need to move somewhere else to be a man. That's Caligula syndrome as well. All these things, Peter Pan syndrome, Caligula syndrome. And historically speaking, the problem with the boy pharaohs and the pillar saints are essentially, think of it as 11-year-olds who want all the advantages of having the grown-up man's penis and be a respected man physically, but doesn't want to pay any of the prices required for that and not take on any of the responsibility.
Yeah, there's a price to be paid. There's a sacrifice to be made and all of that, right?
That pseudo-phallus starts there. That's exactly why these tyrants that we talk about in our work, the anojects who become personified and put on a uniform, have this tendency to be like 11-year-old boys who theatrically perform some kind of masculine exercise, but it's totally fake and it's tyrannical. Peter Pan syndrome is the precursor to the tyranny itself. So if you take the Peter Pan syndrome, which is very common today, and mix it with the anoject, then it's very, very easy right now to run at the forefront of any lynch mob out there and be this guy who runs at the front of the lynch mob and think you're going to get laid by the women. But in reality, inside your own mind, you're an 11-year-old who is separating the mind from the body. They're not unified. They're not a whole. And that's exactly why you're actually really scary and dangerous to other people.
Mm-hmm. So how has that happened in terms of the relationship with the mother and father, like from a Freudian sense? Or
Oh, you're still stuck with the mother. You don't want to go towards the father. Or I say you're stuck close to the mamilla. This is the problem with the welfare state systems we developed. Marx would have hated them, to be honest about it. The welfare systems basically tax mostly men and then redistribute the money and throw it back to women with children and then into the hands of the children. So they all become like young diabetics, obese and all those kinds of things, and you know, sexually frustrated incels or whatever. While we have so many massive psychical problems now with young men today is because we basically foster them into being babies, right? So this mass infantilization hits young men even harder than it hits young women. And that's exactly what we've done since 1945 on you know, and it's gone worse over the last 20 years. And everything from the welfare state to the complete commodification of all human relations to complete commercialization of any human relationship at all of these things, and the fact you stick these guys with pornography and computer games and they do nothing that's meaningful to them any longer means we're going to have huge pandemics of depression and bipolarity. They've already started. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Here's what Byung-Chul Han and I and other guys agree completely. And this is a result, Caligula syndrome, this is a result of a society that hates phallus or completely misunderstands what phallus is for.
Mm-hmm. Or doesn't have the mechanisms for the young men to go away from the, you know, doesn't have an attractive goal for the young men, you know, to get off of sucking this gigantic, you know, mother's breast.
Yeah, there is a real you know, there's a lot of authenticity to the type of guy that Alexander's describing, in the sense, you know,
right.
the very real question of why bother, why sacrifice is authentic. It's saying, look, it looks like the society that's set up around me is set up in so many ways where any action I do is going to lead me into a tragedy. I don't see that I don't see elder men who I can respect and look up to. I don't see men who are, who got married and had kids and who look like they're respected and look like they're doing well. Yeah. I don't see any occupations or jobs where it seems like if I work hard, I'm going to be able to do something meaningful and I'm going to be able to do something that actually helps people. I see people who are becoming bureaucrats who aren't helping people. I see people who are, doing, like David Graeber, rest in peace, David Graeber. David Graeber, bullshit jobs. Everything's bullshit jobs. Everything's empty. You wear, like you have that, I forget the movie, but it's like this.
Yeah. How can you respect your father if he's doing a bullshit job? If he's not doing something a little bit heroic or
you have to be able to
a heroic quality to him. What?
You have to be able to respect the father, what he does, how he handles himself. It's like those horrible parents who say, listen to what I say, don't watch what I do. No, watch what I do. Yeah. Don't even listen to what I say. Watch what I do. This is why a lot of men, boys and men, young men are opting out, and I think they're right to do it. And I think that in that sense, there's going to be a huge transition where these boys are going to need a rite of passage and serious initiation. Yeah, and I think actually that the psychedelic revolution might provide ceremony. Actual deep religious ceremony with shamans, with people with men who have already gone through their initiation and have become men and who have overcome their attachment to the mother and who have been able to integrate their identity as a father. And as Alexander Bard says, in the notion of fatherhood, in the way Bard says, in terms of fatherhood is any activity where older men are taking care of younger men and trying to point them in the right direction. This is the act of the father. I can be a father to a 20-year-old guy who's coming to me and looking for guidance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I agree completely. Yeah, that's exactly what needs.
I almost want to say amen because it's so absolutely obviously true at this point that's what we need, and it's the big blind spot of the society on some level.
Yeah, and I think it can only happen with some people that go first. That's why I talk about exodology. So somebody has to lead by example. And then other people can mimic that and they can say, okay, that worked. Okay, let's do it. Let's see if we can invite more people or more guys in that case, to go through that same ritual. But this is what's important here. When you do psychoanalysis, it's impossible to do it unless you first learn to think critically about the world you live in. You first have to understand that, for example, if you're going to deal with Peter Pan syndrome or Caligula syndrome, you better find out which one you're actually going to deal with, which is your main problem here. Are you refusing to grow up, or you haven't been taught how to grow up, or you don't have self-confidence enough to grow up, and you're stuck at the mamilla, although you should have left it when you were 1 year old, and now you're 15 years old and you still haven't left the mamilla, then that's Peter Pan syndrome, needs to be dealt with. Here's how we deal with that. If you're Caligula syndrome, you realize that, oh my God, I live in a society where that pretends that the nomadological has come back and that's the only alternative forward and everything's going to return to the same, or otherwise the planet goes down, or some other dystopian idea, and phalluses are hated and men are wrong and it's called patriarchy and it's evil, or whatever kind of rubbish you're being told. Now, if you realize that that's the case, remember that psychoanalysis starts with learning how to think critically about yourself and the environment you're stuck in. That's why a great psychoanalyst, like a great socioanalyst, will basically throw you back into the world where you live. So you're forced to make up your mind about the world within which you live. You need to learn shit. You need to get knowledge. You need to get informed. Once you are in that realm, when you realize you get self-confident from the fact you're learning and you're truly understanding. I don't mean critical theory in the sense you teach it at academia today, because it's usually rubbish. I mean to think critically properly. Yeah, this psychoanalysis great lesson. Once you've done that, you can then start looking at yourself as this empty subject, the void that tries to fill itself with desires and drives and all those kind of things and repeats those processes or whatever and play around with it. But you can't do that unless you first have defined yourself and what kind of society you live in. The name for this in our work is paradigmatics. Paradigmatics means you've got to find out what kind of paradigm you actually live in. And you will discover very quickly that most people will tell you live in a previous paradigm that's already gone and dead and over. So you got to find out exactly what kind of world do you live in now? What kind of environment is this? How do people relate to all the technologies and things they have around them? And where will people be 30, 40, 50 years from now? So you can orientate yourself within that context. I call it the Aristotelian revival we need right now. We need to understand the context where we're at, to understand the different causes of our behaviors. And to do that, I think it's fundamental to first get to a proper critical theory.
So that's the will to intelligence, I think you called it, right?
No, that's socioanalysis.
And there's also the will to transcendence. Well, I was just thinking about the body-mind thing, and okay.
No.
We need to be thick. Can I finish? We need to think critically, but we also need to go on the vision quest and face death and all that sort of thing.
No. That has nothing to do with will to intelligence. The will to intelligence is the separation, ahura mazda, is a separation of the priest and the king within ourselves and certainly within the community as the two dominant archetypes, the two leaders. The priest is the will to intelligence. The priest has an urge to accumulate all the information about history up until now and provide us with the amor fati that Nietzsche talks about so we can start fresh. Then the priest worships and admires the king or the chieftain, because the king, the chieftain, represents the will to transcendence. This is the will to change the world for the better and to create a new world, a new tomorrow. And that starts with knowing everything about the world you already operate within. Any technologist, any engineer will tell you, I need to know everything about physics and chemistry, and usually also these days biology, to be able to create the technologies we're looking for. Yes, these knowledges are will to intelligence, the urge to accumulate information. This is why priests in all cultures build libraries, store information, save information with the worst coming along in the library or whatever, so information is stored for the future. So you have somewhere to go to learn shit. That's what the monasteries used to do. That's what the academia pretends to do, although it doesn't do it for much longer. But that's exactly what will to intelligence means. So what we do in our work is that we split the will to power in Nietzsche, just like we then split the yang in Taoism, and divide it between the aura and the mazda. And this is the will to transcendence and the will to intelligence. They're two different things. And here's the take on the machine when the machine comes along. The machine can only at best do will to intelligence. It can only at best replace the priest in certain functions, but it can never become the king. It can never become the phallus that wants to change the world for the better and reach higher and make a more noble world. That's impossible. The machine cannot even comprehend that, because that is transcendent. That's the drive towards transcendence in our work, the fourth drive.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The thing I was picking up on was you talked about critical thinking being essential, and we're agreed about that. But there's also this sort of young men who need to go on rites of initiation, and in Cadell's book he talks about death. The needing to become aware of death or become face death on some level. Means I think a young man has to face this kind of violence or face this kind of potential death and really become heroic in the face of death or something. That's just what I was thinking.
Oh yeah, but it's both. I mean, a rite of passage is, let's do as the fathers did before us. Let's have a rite of passage. That's will to transcendence, very priestly. That's exactly what psychedelics.
It's the psychedelic journey as well, right?
For example, yeah. But then the next thing is, here's your mentor. Here's a guy who we as elders believe is the older version of you. And you can develop your own personality in the shadow of this guy, under his protection and his fatherly gaze, his phallic gaze and his fatherly love. Okay. If you do that, if you stay within that realm and you then become the archetype you're supposed to be, so you can serve the tribe and the community, that's contextual. Then you have to go paradigmatic. You have to understand the society we live in. So we can't just do these sort of timeless rituals the way we used to do them, to do rite of passage, and then automatically you become a father or you become a mentor or a grown-up man. No, you also need to understand the specific times you live in. This is where ontology comes in. This is where will to transcendence comes in. This is where the contextual comes in. And that is why I'm adamant that we have to develop ceremonies that are specific for the times we live in, so they make sense today. This is why, for example, your relationship to the laptop and the smartphone and to the dating apps and all those things and the computer games has to be part of the rite of passage, where you renounce certain aspects of what you did in your behavior, but you enhance others to actually think, oh my God, when I do these things, I go constructive, I become phallic, I believe in the vision and the strategy that I subscribe to. I want to be part of that. And these tools help me do that. But Those things are just time pass, waste of time, destructive, take my time away, make me child rather than a grown-up man, throw them away. I think that's when the rite of passage could become really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Does it make sense to Cadell that I'm working with these two levels, or it's this too almost banal to you?
The distinction between will to intelligence and will to transcendence?
Yes.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. This is what we added. We added this to Lacan in Digital Libido. We said it's not just enough with pure drive and desire, all the fantastic, but the mechanistic drive and the human desire that comes out of language are there. Okay. But there's the animalistic instinct, which is, of course, there in Lacan too. He just doesn't pay much attention to it. But it helps to have instinct in one and then transcendence in the other, and explore and understand transcendence as a drive, specifically a phallic drive. It's the drive that is the most masculine drive of them all. Is to try to be part of something bigger than yourself.
I just don't know if that's in contradiction with Lacan. I know that what Lacan says about instinct is that in the human realm, instinct is always drive. Like instinct is always, in some sense, transcendentalized by the symbolic order. Like, so for example, the example I always give is like, you know, eating, fucking, sleeping, and homemaking. You know,
okay. What we did was that we split it.
Those drives, all of those instincts, rather, are filtered through the symbolic order and, in some sense, transcendentalized. So, like the French don't just eat; they transcendentalize a certain ritual practice of eating. It's filtered through the symbolic order, or we can never just fuck. We always have to transcendentalize the drive.
Yeah. Okay, we just split the drive in two and kept pure drive as a mechanistic thing. It's just easy for people to grasp, I think, pedagogically. And then we kept instinct separate as animalistic. So it makes it easier for people to grasp it too. And then we split the desire between desire as the desire of desire and transcendence as the possibility of that. And the trick we did was kind of Hegelian. We did it. We just imagined that, say you come out of Lacan analysis and you've actually succeeded. In the sense that you understand what's actually going on. You're trapped in it. You will be trapped in it. You get that. But you can actually understand what's going on. So you could actually take part in something that transcends you. Meaning that, for example, you can understand you're going to die one day, but you can actually leave a heritage that doesn't have to be absolutely meaningless. It can actually have some meaning to it. And it helps me, at least, to understand that as a drive itself. So our drive system has 4 drives: instinct, and transcendence. And of course, transcendence, we usually then call the divine, or, you know, it aspires towards the divine. And you would say that desire is strictly human. It's tied to language. Pure drive itself is mechanistic. It's almost like you're a machine. You're just doing it. You can't stop doing it. You're repeatedly doing it, and you can't stop doing it. It just sticks with you. Whereas the animalistic instinct doesn't necessarily have to be that way. But we just made it slightly more complex, maybe more so than we had to. But I agree, Lacan does not contradict that. It's just that we developed it into 4 drive series.
Cadell, I wonder, like me and Alexander talk a lot about Tantra or something, that being an essential kind of thing for all of this that we're talking about in a sense, which is a more sophisticated notion of sexuality. I wonder if you've reflected on Tantra or if you have any thoughts about Tantra.
Yeah, so there's a distinction that Freud makes between fore-pleasure and end-pleasure. And of course, the fore-pleasure is type of like the enjoyment from.
I can't hear you, Cadell.
Oh, we lost your microphone there.
We lost your microphone for a second.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, now we can hear you. Yeah.
So Freud makes a distinction between fore-pleasure and end-pleasure, with fore-pleasure being, of course, things like foreplay, and the end-pleasure being kind of like the build-up to the orgasm. And I do think that men today are too sloppy with end pleasure. Let's say something like that. And that if Tantra is the sort of an attempt to educate our sexual drive and to, you know, prolong it and play with it and dramatize it and you know, play with the fore-pleasure, I think that this is an example of a maturing man.
Okay, well, I agree with that, but my definition of Tantra is something it begins with the sexual metaphor, but it expands into pretty much everything. Like it's not just about sex.
But that would be endlessly delaying the end pleasure and expanding the fore pleasure so much that the libidinal energy infuses into everything, and everything in some sense can become sexual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or derive a type of enjoyment, which...
Well, bliss. Everything becomes bliss in Tantra. It becomes bliss, basically. It becomes sort of bliss pain too. It's not just sort of a happy bliss.
Yeah, it's exploring a sort of optimization of libido over long periods of time, which is interesting because it's the opposite of Mortito, and why not? I use Tantra in our work because we introduced the Barred Absolute, and the Barred Absolute we think is what's missing in Christianity and Islam, and as certainly is missing in Western culture. It's totally alien to an Indian or a Chinese person, or say Zoroastrian from Persia, not to have a Barred Absolute in their religion. So it is with Judaism. The Barred Absolute is essentially that we don't talk to God directly. We talk to the lesser gods. Even in Catholicism, you go and pray to a saint because you can't talk to God himself. And then the saint will talk to God on your behalf. Now, that's just this very simple version of that. And so if you think of the temple of the religion, when you're going to preach and teach people in the community how they best maintain the community, nomadologically, and maybe even aspire to something better, eventuologically, you do that. You say you're on the stairs and you're a preacher, you preach the community. And that's essentially what sutra is. The sutra acknowledges that this is how the world operates. And if you keep with the sutra, you can keep with the community, and community keeps going. But the tantric realm is basically to realize that, wait a second, though, there is knowledge beyond that, but it's not for everyone. And because not for everyone, you got to be a person who either has the talent to be able to absorb that knowledge, or you got to come to a certain point in your life when you've done all the other things, you ticked all the boxes you're supposed to do, and we can now crown you one of the elders or one of the shamanoids, and you can then go into the tantric realm. That's exactly why we mimic all the way while we're in sutra, but when the mimicking has to stop, you need a crazy wisdom teacher. You're grown up enough, or you're talented enough, or you can handle these situations enough, so you can handle something way beyond that.
So you can meet
no
God.
Longer mimic.
We can meet God directly in a sense,
No, it looks like that to the outside world because, exactly. That's how we associate the tantric with divine realms. But actually, you become one of the lesser gods in a way to other people, in the sense that you are inside a barred absolute. And once you're inside that barred absolute, which is the opposite of the barred subject in psychoanalysis, the barred absolute is just basically the barred object, in the sense that you should not go beyond that point unless you're prepared for it. Well, and if you're prepared for it, it's not that you choose to go beyond that point, but actually somebody says that you're ready for it, and you believe them, and they guide you beyond that point.
Well, there's always a barred absolute, no matter where.
Yeah, and beyond the barred absolute, you find out that the teachers are crazy wisdom. They go absolutely nuts and behave in the most erratic ways, and you're very ambivalent about them. They fuck your wife and they get drunk and take tons of drugs away. It doesn't matter. They behave like assholes, essentially. Why? Because it makes it impossible for you to mimic them, because everything you've done up until that point has been mimicking. And the idea with Tantra is to have, even if you're still a void, is to have a sense of self that goes beyond the strictly mimicking. You're no longer a robot. You become deeply human. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, what shamanoid people desire, because the shamanoids are then hired by everybody else to talk to the gods on their behalf. Why? Because the shamanoids handle all communication with external world. The shamanoids are the only people who can peacefully walk into the next village without getting killed. The shamanoids are the only people who can walk straight through the battlefield with their shamanic dresses on. And we don't kill them because we need them as go-betweens in case we can finally arrive at some kind of a peace negotiation in the middle of the war. This is what shamanoid people do. But because they handle all external relations between tribes, they, of course, also handle the vertical external relations, which are talking to the gods. This is the origin of the saints and the martyrs and those things in the history of religion, is that these are all shamanoid characters. But the shamanoid personality is not for everyone. Very few people can handle being shamanoid, staying within a shamanoid state. That is why Tantra is not for everyone in Eastern culture. That's why we should not just throw our psychedelics around into the mouths of anybody who opens their mouth, because that will just fuck people up immensely. We got to do this carefully. We got to know what we're doing. It's sacred knowledge. It's done in sacred spaces. We have to behave in a crazy wisdom way when we do it. Yeah. So that we cannot be mimicked.
So we've tried sort of mass tantra before, and it's ended up, in the 60s by dosing everybody, or
Well,
all these
thankfully,
other Osho cult and things like that, where people just go mad, right? But
no, but it wasn't even tantra. So I'm glad to note that when tantra is being explored as a commercial product in a capitalist society, it's so flat and so boring and so bland, and it's basically just dare to sleep with somebody else but your wife for a while. It's just hippie nonsense. It's nothing to do with tantra in any Tibetan or Chinese or Indian tradition that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
No, but that's the name of it, and I think a Western name in the sense of west of the Gobi Desert, looking through Islam and Christianity and discovering that basically Mormonism and Scientology long before they existed. To me, that is a strong case for going into these sort of much more mature religions that have been around for thousands of years, that have these long spiritual traditions, and that deal with phallus and matrix properly and not just throw it away, ready to be commercialized. And that is the strength of Judaism and Zoroastrianism to me, that they're responding to that. And Vajrayana Buddhism certainly is that I find in these rich traditions the separation of Tantra and Sutra, which again is that it's just a where you stand on the stairs. Are you in front of the temple or are you inside? And if you're inside the temple, are you in the sacred room? And who's allowed to enter the room? Only the people who prepared for it. Nobody else should be there. But in that room is where protopianism will be practiced in the new digital age. That means in that room where you isolate yourself, you can practice creativity on a level we've probably never seen before in human history. That's my great hope for the man-technology interface. That's my singularity. And I'll call it protopianism. The Barred Absolute, that's what we call it. I think it needs to be reinstated. And I think that's part of the maturing of religion, or what I call the adultification of Western society. We finally come to the point where civilization itself needs to go through a rite of passage. And we're not prepared for it all. We're probably more infantile than ever, but it's necessary. We can't solve the current problems we have ahead of us unless we go through the adultification process as a society as a whole.
Okay, so, we've covered sex, masculinity, and God, right? The name of Cadells.
Yeah, I want to hear a Cadells
fantastic book. We've talked about all these subjects, like these are the subjects that have been spontaneously coming up, and it's all related to sex, masculinity, and God. So not only is it's a great title, it has, and it's all the taboos that we're struggling against in the society to talk, and difficulty. We have a difficult of talking about these things.
I think it's a wonderful book, and the book is Cadell and two friends who basically recorded their dialogue. It's like a great podcast written. It's just, and I think most of all, again, as a model, which Cadell talks a lot about, it's a great model for inviting a couple of friends over and do the same conversation between you.
Yeah.
What is?
Have you noticed that the trialogue is something that I don't know? I think the trialogue is great somehow, and I think there's a dynamic presence in a trialogue, which is not always present just in one-on-one. Did you notice that with these three guys that you were working with, or two guys? Let's say Kevin and Daniel and Cadell.
Well, we specifically designed it to be a trialogue. And I put a lot of work into the, yes, we live recorded, but I tried to come up with basically a structure for the conversation and a specific quote for each chapter, which would sort of lead us into a type of interesting territory where it wasn't just chaotic, but we would actually be able to work towards some sort of, new idea or new perspective on whatever the topic of a given chapter was. So like, for example, sexual difference or love and death or ethics and morality. We really wanted to go into these topics in an open way, but a structured way. And we wanted to basically, try to make sense of the present moment of love and death, the present moment of ethics and morality, the present moment of sexual difference, and try to, give some sort of direction both in method, as Bard said. Other guys can easily do this, and I would encourage other guys to do this because it's really helps you to sharpen your own understanding of yourself, but also to really develop a method like with the trialogue where people can collectively come to new ideas on a higher order level. I think it's one of the great missing pieces of the scientific enterprise, where I always say you'll have a textbook on collective intelligence written by one guy. So how well does he know collective intelligence? Doesn't sound like he's embodying it. So I mean, this type of thing happens all the time in science, where they'll talk about distributed intelligence, they'll talk about collective intelligence, they'll talk about self-reflectivity, they'll talk about embodied cognition, but they don't do any of these things. They don't live any of these things. And so we really wanted to live this out, and we wanted to show that it's possible for three men of a similar status and a similar age to come together, power share, disagree, but disagree respectfully in a way that the conflict produces new ideas.
Yeah,
I agree completely. So it's pathos and will to transcendence. So the way I look at it is this: if you just got to summarize it pedagogically to 23-year-old who might want to read Sex, Masculinity, and God, I would say this: instead of looking for recognition from women, you should find recognition from other men. This is how three guys sat down, wrote a trialogue, and got the recognition they needed from other men. That's what recognition is for a man, because a woman is somebody you deliver to, is not somebody you seek recognition from, and that colors the entire book. So I would say that's a strong advice for the book, and get inspired to do similar things if you're 23 years old. And by the way, for next year, 2021, hopefully the corona will be over by then, I would love to do men's work together with the two of you. I mean, the European Men's Gathering and the men's movement across Europe at the moment inspires me immensely. This book that you wrote, Cadell with Your Friends, is part of that process. And Andrew and I have been involved for a couple of years, and I really look forward to develop new forms of men's work together with you guys. I think it would be absolutely awesome. And because we're basing it on the Ora Mastai, the mind work and the body work, half of each at least, every event you do, work on your mind and your body. And start
so
with—
it's not just a new age event. There's
real— No, it's not.
It's not just a touchy-feely thing, but it also is really embodied and really alive and really kind of dynamic and
it's really built from what men discover when they're together with other men and ask themselves the serious, sincere question: what do we need? What do we need as a group, and what do we need individually? That's the question we're answering at these events, and just like your book did. And I really look forward to be working with you guys next year, and hopefully once the corona is over and the face masks are gone, we can start doing these major men's events again. Because I'd love them to be physical. I hate to do this stuff digital. This should definitely be physical, in the body, with the bodies present. Absolutely.
We massively miss something with the virtual. I mean, it has to be physical. We have to be there wrestling with each other in the real.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Wrestling in the mud.
Can be metaphorical or literal. Like, I mean, I see like what we're doing right now as a type of wrestling match, and it's what I think good men can do, is to play in competition, and to really sharpen each other, not in a way that I win and you lose, or you win and I lose, but in a way that we all sharpen each other.
This is kind of how we started the conversation with talking about the atomistic culture and moving into the spirit of collaboration, right?
Yeah, it's pro-topianism. That's the word for it. And it's participatory culture, take it to the next step. Besides the men's movement, for example, personally, me and my team are involved with Burners and Burning Man, and the more than 200 spin-offs from Burning Man around the world, that even more interest in the Burning Man today. And now, after I came back from Prague, I love the hackers out there. I love the open source movements and things like that. And the idea of decentralized internet to fight the tech giants. I became best friends with Douglas Rushkoff, and that's just wonderful in itself. Those three things to me, the burner movement and the hackers and the men's movement and the new women's movement that comes out of it, the sort of new post-feminist women's movement too, these are really great things that are happening at the moment. And they got more energy out of digital during the corona months, but we're all dying for the physical events now and for the augmented reality of being both digital and physical at the same time. I'm dying for physical events. And yeah, I'm going to go to Tuscany for a while now and write a book and isolate myself with a face mask when I walk outside the door. But I'm so much dying to get beyond this so we can go back to the physical meetups. Yes.
Yeah, indeed.
Meanwhile, we write books and we make podcasts.
Yeah.
All three of us.